All right. Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Patrick with HealthWorks Medical. I think we are live. I am super excited. Me and Dr. Turnbow are here today, kind of back in our webinar series this year with a topic I'm super excited about, diving into the concept of executive health strategy for organizations. And before we get too far in, I was hoping we could do just a quick kind of audio check here. Anybody out there, just want to make sure we're coming through. We can see the slides and audio okay. If anybody in the chat, if we could get like a thumbs up or okay that you can hear us okay, I would really appreciate it before we get 10 minutes in and nobody can hear us. Thank you. Got some responses there. I can hear you. Thank you so much. But yeah, let's jump right in. Topic of today is protecting the people you cannot afford to lose. And myself and Dr. Turnbow are here. We're going to jump into the concept of executive health strategies. What are they? What's the use for them? And then what are some ways you can implement this and consider these for your own organization and leadership continuity planning? So let's jump right in. Absolutely. Excited to host here today. So just real quick, for those that are maybe new here, my name is Patrick Howe. I'm the CEO of HealthWorks Medical. Kind of my background, been in the occupational health world for about 20 years now. Kind of grew up in the military medicine world, working for Uncle Sam early on. Kind of my specialty is kind of the administrative and economic side of healthcare, specialized in healthcare economics and research. Kind of later on in my career, I'm kind of a data geek, for lack of a better word. So I love the numbers and the ROI and the challenges of how to support and shape these types of programs for organizations. So that's just a little bit about me. I'll pass it to Dr. Turnbow.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kyle Turnbow. So I've spent the better part of the last 30 years really in family medicine, preventative medicine, and occupational medicine. So my whole career has been about trying to identify disease states before they become a problem and prevention of the disease state to begin with. And I think the country has, for a large segment of the population, been in a stance of waiting until disease develops to identify it and then treat it. And I think the focus that we've tried to hone in on is how do you prevent people from getting disease to begin with, and then if they do have disease, what's the earliest possible way in which to detect that? So I'm excited to talk about that.
Yeah, it's the only other thing that I'll add, Dr. Turnbow, I know we've been privileged as a company for the past almost 2 decades now to really kind of have a unique front row seat working and supporting our clients, several hundred clients now all over the country, from mom and pop businesses to international billion-dollar, companies, really supporting them in their medical programs and medical strategies. So I love these conversations of how we're taking kind of lessons learned. We're not keeping those in a vacuum, and we're kind of bringing that back out to the market, to organizations, saying, hey, here's the things that we've seen work. So really,
and particularly now in healthcare and in medicine, it's such a ever evolving a field of longevity and early detection and preventative care. And the other thing that compounds this is that there's so much on social media that you don't know what to believe. And I will tell you a good percentage of that you should not believe. But there are some things that are innovative and are factual and follow good science that we can kind of talk about.
So you're telling me TikTok is not clinically based, evidence-based medicine?
It is not.
Oh, man.
There are some things, and there are some people who have some good content on social media that are worth following. But I would say the majority of them are probably not worth following. They're trying to sell you something, usually some sort of a multi-billion-dollar supplement that they say is the cure for everything. And I find a lot of patients falling into that loop where they buy these things and they don't understand why it didn't have the promise that it was delivered, or didn't deliver the promise that was offered.
Well, it's good to know what we're talking about here today is going to be evidence-based, clinically based medicine, and arguably more importantly, real-world proven approaches to things that we've seen and we've validated over the past several decades. So really, this is not TikTok today. This is real-world clinical feedback. So let's jump to the next slide if we could. Before we get too far in, I just wanted to throw this out kind of to the audience. To think about. I would ask just kind of a posing question here before we get too far in. Question is, how many people in your organization would you say are truly irreplaceable? So, another way to think about it, if you lost this key player on your team today and they were gone, let's just call it several months, it says 3 to 6 months on the slide here, but, your business would suffer. Replacing them would cost months and be very, very expensive. And maybe arguably more importantly, they hold kind of that institutional knowledge, relationships, and kind of operational decision-making that no one else can make easily. So I want you guys to kind of think about that and just really be open and honest. And, I'd love to see some answers in the chat here. Is that one person? Is that 2 to 3 people? Is that 6 people plus? But would love to get your thoughts on how many people within your current organizations that you're a part of now would fit this criteria of being hard to replace. So seeing some responses already, but let's keep those coming in, please. All right, so let's jump to the next slide while those responses are coming in. So kind of the argument or idea we're gonna propose here today is, we all approach risk in our organizations differently. Risk isn't something that can always just show up on a report or a balance sheet that we can't just go get an insurance policy to solve. And I kind of want you all to think about, risk in a way from a leadership perspective, a people perspective, that I would argue that the biggest risk in most of our organizations, ours included, isn't a thing, it's a person. It's people, it's key leaders within your organization. So let's jump to likely what, most organizations, how they approach, mitigating this. Obviously, there's leadership loss. This isn't a new concept. The catastrophic version of this is, many of you have probably heard key man policies. We can insure to a certain extent against leadership loss. But Kathy, if you would hit like the next 2 there, let's get all the way down to 3. Regardless of how you guys are postured against leadership loss, there's always going to be the risk of the knowledge gap that would follow, the decision-making disruption and the chaos that would kind of ensue as a result of that, right? So this conversation today is one way that we can plan against that. Let's jump to the next slide. So what does losing a key leader actually look like? So this is real world data coming from a variety of different institutions and studies. This particularly is fed largely by the Society of Human Resource Managers and Professionals. They conducted a multi-year study that looked at key leader replacement costs between the search and replacement, a 6 to 12 months of onboarding cost, your current stalled initiatives that would likely result as a part of that transition, and then just the key relationships and knowledge that would likely suffer during that transition. What they found is it's not uncommon for those transitions to cost upwards of 2 times that leadership's annual salary or more once that disruption takes place. So I thought that was really interesting as far as tying a number to the transition itself. Kind of leads us to what we're stair-stepping into today. Most health programs that we've seen from our perspective are just very generic, very, very boilerplate in concept. We see these programs that exist for, you're from the frontline worker all the way up to the CEO of the company look exactly the same, and ultimately this kind of snowballs into what we're kind of calling a corporate risk health problem for the organization. If we want to mitigate leadership continuity and leadership transition risk, we really are kind of talking about how do we do that specifically for said leader. That health program and that health strategy, should look a little bit different. So that leads us into kind of the concept that we're going to introduce today. What is executive health? Which is, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Turnbow here, but high level, it is a concept of an added layer of screening, monitoring, and support for the people your business cannot function without. So with that, Dr. Turnbow, I'd like to kind of transition it to you from a physician perspective. We're kind of getting into this idea of what is a standard physical, kind of how it looks for just, let's call it general population versus this idea of kind of a heightened, expanded physical within an executive health program.
Thank you, Patrick, for the question. I think to understand this better, you have to understand where do we get the recommendations for screening of the general population. I mean, when you go to your family physician and get an annual physical, what guidelines is that family physician using to screen you for the most common chronic diseases and or catastrophic conditions? And all of that comes from a group called the United States Preventative Task Force. And the United States Preventative Task Force is a group of experts, particularly in public health, which analyze really cost. And so it's based on cost per life year gained, right? So it's a statistical analysis of how much money would you have to spend to screen the population to get one extra life year or a year of life. And that's one way to look at it. And in a country our size of 325 plus million people, and there's only limited resources, it makes sense to determine how you're going to overall screen the general population and get the most bang for your bucks. Now, I would argue, and this is a whole different conversation, that we spend and waste enough money in healthcare that we could give everybody in this country an executive health physical and probably still come out ahead if we didn't waste so much money, but that's a different topic. However, this can be somewhat controversial when you're taking one group and treating them differently than the others. Is that an ethical issue? It's really just a cost value analysis, right? And so the cost of replacing key people in your executive leadership team is such that it is worth it, as you've just kind of outlined on a value add and a return on investment, to capture diseases as early as possible and or prevent diseases as early as possible, because the cost, both direct and indirect, to replacement of those people to your organization is quite high. So I'll start by kind of just giving you some background about why when you go to your family doctor, you're getting just kind of less than you were probably 20 years ago. So most of you will probably remember that when you went to your doctor 20 years ago, men got prostate examinations after the age of 40. Everybody got a PSA. Women got more frequent pap smears and screening tests. And those recommendations have gone up and down over the last 20 years. And it's not because the evidence shows that catching it early is not a good thing. The reason for the change of that is because the bean pushers and the folks at the United States Preventative Task Force have decided that it costs too much money to save one life year. So now, if you're that one person that it saves their life year, it's 100% to you worth it. So we're talking about taking the basic guidelines from the task force and expanding that to things that are evidence-based, that can improve and early detect things that are reversible. And with today's healthcare, if you had gotten lung cancer 20 years ago, it would be hard to catch it early enough to make a significant difference on the outcome and your long-term survivability. Now, with the invention of, and most people probably know that we do low-dose CT scanning regularly on folks, and that is something that's recommended by the United States Task Force. Finding tumors early allows us to resect those before they move to other portions of the body, and have saved countless lives from early detection standards. Why have we not rolled that out to everybody? Why do we not do head-to-toe low-dose CT scanning and early detection? It is not because it doesn't do any good. It's because the cost of doing that for everybody in the country at this point doesn't make good sense. So our approach to this is we have a technology available to us from both head-to-toe low-dose CT scanning and or MRI, use of genetic analysis, early cancer detection mechanisms, use of biologics and use of peptides and things that actually do have some clinical benefit. GLP-1s are the peptide that everybody knows now for weight loss and diabetes management. But freeing up and getting outside of the standard cookie cutter approach that is dictated by the United States Preventive Task Force, not that those things are not good, but adding upon those to have a broader strategic analysis and a more in-depth analysis to capture things early is clearly beneficial in longevity.
Yeah, no, that's a good rundown. And I think that's a good segue kind of for the next slide here.
Yeah, I like this slide a lot. The number one killer in Americans is cardiovascular disease by far and away. So most people, to put that in layman's terms, are going to die of a heart attack or a stroke the majority of the time, right? So what can we do to be as proactive as possible? And there are so many new technologies and screening techniques that are available to detect early atherosclerosis. And with that, there are a number of newly available medications and supplements that can be used to reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. So obviously the goal is to prevent cardiovascular disease to begin with. You don't want it to start, but you got to start somewhere. So the start is, do you have any right now that you don't know about? And unfortunately, the majority of people that die from acute myocardial infarctions or heart attacks, the first one they have is the one that kills them. So that's the majority of the people die from sudden death from acute myocardial infarction out in the field. So we need to be ahead of that curve, finding what your disease, identifying what your risk factors are, using scans and techniques to identify early atherosclerosis, and then doing everything we can to reverse that atherosclerosis. So that's what our executive kind of health physical is designed to do, is to use every available biomarker from a laboratory standpoint, whether that's high sensitivity reactive proteins, ApoB, lipoprotein A, and things that you're not typically going to get in a basic annual physical examination, coupling that with low-dose scanning techniques to determine if calcium scores are elevated, and if so, then proceeding with CTA evaluations to look for any actual atherosclerosis and blockages early before they become pathologic and detrimental.
Yeah.
And then second is metabolic syndrome. I mean, a good portion of the country, 30+%, have metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is simply obesity, so having waist circumference in excess of 40 for a man, and having hypertension and having diabetes. All of those kind of fall in a group together, and they are the drivers for cardiovascular disease and other conditions that are common in chronic disease. So it is important for us to do metabolic syndrome markers. Obviously you do a first screen. If you can easily identify metabolic syndrome, there's no need to go in depth into, are you at risk for developing it? But that's as far as most screens go. If you don't have an A1C that's elevated, if you don't have a fasting glucose that's elevated, they stop there. Well, there are markers that can tell you if you're on your way. It's typically a 10-year process from being completely normal to the development of clinically evident metabolic syndrome. So 10 years is a long time for us to be able to detect something and modify it before you actually get the metabolic syndrome. So if you use some of these early biomarkers, you can identify folks who are in that 10-year period and intervene to prevent them from actually developing the disease to begin with. That's called tertiary prevention. And that's really where primary prevention, which is really where we want to be, where most of this country spends their time in tertiary prevention, treating it after it's already developed. And then 3 is early cancer markers. And I think this is probably one of the biggest developments in the country over the past 12 months. Early cancer markers have really expanded in their availability and their capabilities. We have now can draw the blood and determine for 60+ types of cancers early detection with that serum analysis. There are some genetic analysis. Now, I think genetic analysis has a little bit more of a controversy. So just because you may have a genetic tendency toward a disease does not mean you're going to get a disease. So you weigh the risk of worrying somebody to death about a potential disease that they may never get. I think that's a little bit more of a conversation that we would have with our executives about, what are we going to do with this if we have it? Is it something that you want to proceed with? And if so, this is how I would suggest we manage the information. But the early cancer markers, I think, is tremendous because just like the low-dose CT scan, if you can identify that there's early evidence of a movement towards a cancer, and you can then hone in on it and get it taken care of or treated before it actually metastasizes, your chance of survival just goes through the roof. And so that's kind of how we have designed our process, because these are the three things that kill people in the United States: cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, and cancer. And so doing everything we can with all the current available technology is how we're designing this. Now, the thing about this is all three of those things are changing on a daily basis. So it is my job as the medical director to stay on top of what is actually facts and what is actually TikTok. And that can be somewhat challenging, but using reputable sources that have controlled studies that are true indicators of what is recommended is kind of what we're trying to follow.
And no, thank you for that, Dr. Turnbow. And for the audience listening, I don't want to jump too far ahead here, but I want to give you like two real examples to kind of quantify what this could look like from a dollars and cents perspective for you or your team. Two things on here that I get really excited about, Dr. Turnbow, is, you mentioned kind of the speed at which the technology is changing on these things. Two tests that could probably both be completed for somewhere around $1,000, give or take.
Yeah.
Calcium CT scan and a full genetic cancer panel, right, off the shelf, right? Those two tests alone mitigating 80% of your most catastrophic health challenges that you would face. Like, I think that is significant in the advancement of technology as of today.
It is, and coronary CT scans have become significantly inexpensive. I mean, down to $175, $150, depending on what part of the market. Some places in larger markets maybe up to $250, but that's a drop in the bucket for a CT scan that will tell you whether or not you have early evidence of the beginning of atherosclerosis. Now, just because you have an elevated calcium score does not mean that you have blockages, but your chances of having blockages without any calcium in your coronaries is much lower. Now, it's not zero, but it's much, much lower. So I think that is tremendous. Now, the thing that costs the majority of that $1,000 is these early cancer markers because they're so new to the scene. But if your company has the capabilities to afford early cancer marker detections for your key people, I highly would recommend it because it is going to be a game changer. Now, there's so much to talk about, and we don't have time to talk about it in the next hour we're here. But most people are probably seeing on the news the most recent changes with the vaccination for pancreatic cancer, for instance. We are going to see dramatic improvements in treatment for chronic disease with messenger RNA technology that was first pioneered really in the 90s, but really came to popularity with the COVID vaccination. But the easiest way to understand mRNA technology is it's a find and replace feature, much like you would have on a computer, right? So you tell the computer to go find all of these and replace them with and having the genetic project, the genome project that mapped all the DNA, and then subsequently being able to identify which genes are abnormal in certain disease processes, and then having a technology that can find them and replace them with normal genetic code is a game changer. And that's exactly what this vaccination does for pancreatic cancer, significantly increasing the survivability. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. And so to be able to intervene like that, you're going to need to identify people early in the disease process to get the most benefit from those kind of connections.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we've kind of hit this piece already, like the gap between disease starts and when we usually catch it. You kind of talked about some of that timeline already, Dr. Turnbow, as far as trying to shift that detection window as far as possible to the left.
Yeah, so this slide would indicate that early detection window for the example of metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes would probably be a 10-year on that axis.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of time to detect it. But if you're talking about cancer, it could be months.
Yeah.
In that early detection window, typically 6 months to a year. So if we can find early cancer, we can make a significant difference in patients' clinical outcome.
Absolutely. Dr. Turnbow, one thing I would like to just kind of ask from your perspective, let's kind of reframe from the patient perspective here. So Patrick's used to going to my primary care doctor, getting the standard off-the-shelf cookie cutter kind of primary wellness physical. We've touched on a little bit of this already, but I know we kind of came up with, these four kind of pillars to the difference between that and an executive health kind of deeper dive. Could we dive into that just a little bit?
Yeah, I'm sure happy to do that. So having spent 26 years in the primary care world, it's frustrating. I do not at all want to minimize the important work that primary care clinicians are performing throughout the country because they're doing the best they can with what they've got. But if we're trying to design the best possible mechanism to identify and early detect and modify disease, then it takes more time. One, physicians and practitioners are reimbursed on volume still. It's still a fee for service. And so the amount of time that they have to spend with the patient is limited, which makes their ability to customize and hear and understand what the client or the patient needs is much more inhibited. Their ability to get some of these expanded tests, because insurance companies will not pay for them, becomes a hurdle because a lot of patients can't afford them. Doing a more thorough cardiovascular risk assessment. So a lot of times we use tools like the Framingham risk analysis to determine if someone has a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. But honestly, physicians and clinicians are so pressured and so hurried that whether or not they truly analyze that and equate that to risk analysis and a treatment plan, I would say the majority of the time they just don't have the time to do it. So I think in this country, if you get an annual physical examination, you're going to get some basic things done, which I think is good for the majority of people, but it's inadequate if you're trying to do everything that you possibly can to detect those three conditions that we talked about before. Advanced lab screenings like apoprotein B and Lp(a), some of the expanded high sensitivity C-reactive proteins, inflammatory markers, homocysteine levels, things of those natures that are a much better predictor if someone's going to have atherosclerotic disease than just a plain lipid profile. Now, I am a big believer that a lipid profile and treating LDL cholesterol, I think that's a fantastic thing to do, but that's really treating the disease after it started. If you want to identify people before they have a problem, you need to do a little more in-depth analysis. And then, personalizing a care plan, I think that involves more than just, getting some data and throwing it at a patient. I think you have to develop with them a very clear pathway of how they're going to modify behavior. Exercise, no matter what we say or do here, nothing is going to get away from me telling people that they need to exercise 150 minutes of cardiovascular exercise a week, and they need to do 3 days a week of strength training, and they need to eat a Mediterranean diet. If you look at all the studies and everything on TikTok and everybody telling you how to lose body fat, and if you just take this L-carnitine or whatever it is, or this biologic or a peptide, that it's going to melt everything away and you can just eat whatever you want, all of that is not true. You're still going to have to behave. And so the clinical evidence would say that we should all be recommending a Mediterranean diet for everybody because it is by far and away the most proven diet to prevent cardiovascular disease, and that we should be encouraging people to have a love-hate relationship with their treadmill because 150 minutes of exercise a week makes a huge difference, approximately 50% reduction in risk of heart attack and stroke if you do appropriate cardiovascular exercise. So we're not going to get away from that. I'm going to tell you that we're going to tell you that at the end of your visit, if you're not already doing that, you need to be doing that. But giving people the appropriate tools with an exercise physiologist and a dietitian to help support that plan, because we're all humans and we're Americans, so we have access to way too much food. So we're gonna slip up. But developing a plan with some feedback and some follow-up in that that helps you be successful is key.
And I appreciate the perspective from the physician perspective on that, Dr. Turnbow, like the fee for schedule, the treadmill, literally the clicks and the volume. I think it's important to understand the patient perspective as well, and maybe speak to that regarding a lot of the folks that we're talking about here. When we talk about key leaders and business owners and founders and executives, the most valuable thing is their time, right? And when we talk about a medical program that's more than a one-stop office visit, and now all of a sudden I got to do these 7 other things,
right,
to have this holistic view of a snapshot of my health, that's where things get a little tricky too, right? And I know part of the intent when we design this program is to have it as efficient and consolidated as possible. So like when I show up to meet with my executive physician, I'm doing everything that I need as much as possible in that one-stop shop, right? Like my labs, my imaging, my diagnostics, all these other things that your average kind of primary care funnel may not be able to logistically handle.
Right. So all of that should be done and the results available by the time you see the physician, so that you can develop that treatment plan, and or, you know, if you're doing really well and you're doing your exercise and you're following your diet and your markers all look good, then you can just pat you on the back and see you back.
Yeah.
You know, it is to be efficient and good stewards of our clients' time, as well as the clinician's time, to be able to provide the best, you know, recommendations. All of that stuff needs to be done prior to and have the results available. And we just happen to have the setup where we have that stuff on site, so we can get that stuff done relatively quickly.
Absolutely. So as we kind of round out here, and I want to make sure we got plenty of time for questions, I'm going to circle back, do some audience engagement, some Q&A here, because we already got a lot of questions coming across. And I failed to mention this at the beginning. If you guys have any specific questions that you want to make sure me or Dr. Turnbow hit, feel free to kind of send them over in the chat. We'll kind of get those teed up. I see a couple coming through already that we're kind of flagging to follow up here in the next couple minutes. So yeah, please feel free to drop questions in the chat or send them kind of direct message to us as well. But Dr. Turnbow, really the next 2 things we kind of wanted to hit quickly is a couple real world examples. And one, wanted to kind of point out to the audience is this isn't always about the catastrophe, right? We're talking about, you know, the main causes, the main killers, from heart disease to cancer to metabolic syndrome. But sometimes it's just about having your people feel better and operate better. It's not always the catastrophe. I know this was a real world example of a patient we had, kind of like a sleep apnea kind of intervention scenario. I didn't know if you wanted to kind of speak briefly about this.
Yeah, so I think you know, identifying things that are affecting performance, whether that be mental health. I mean, mental health is a real consideration for folks in the C-suite. Executives are under a large amount of stress, and being able to identify their stressors and help them with coping mechanisms, whether that's, you know, diet, exercise, or cognitive behavioral therapy, to try to help change the mindset. That's very important. A lot of people have obstructive sleep apnea and never know it. I mean, people have this thought that they have to be 300 pounds and snoring like a freight train to have obstructive sleep apnea, and that's just not true. And so, you know, doing a screening test for obstructive sleep apnea and identifying that early and correcting it can make a huge difference in people's functioning as well as their overall health, because obstructive sleep apnea affects, you know, blood pressure and increases metabolic syndrome, affects metabolism. So specifically to obstructive sleep apnea, it's important for us to do. We do a screen test called the stop bang analysis, just to make sure that we capture people who could be at risk for obstructive sleep apnea.
Yeah. So that's kind of one conversation, right? Like how are we just optimizing health for your key leaders? And then kind of on the next slide, we're going to get into another real world example. We're obviously changing names and some titles here just for, you know, patient privacy, but this was a real world example we had with, you know, an executive leader, large company here, regionally here in the Midwest, served a key role within their organization. And, you know, jump into the next slide. When we walked this person through an executive style physical, you know, Dr. Turnbow, feel free to jump in here, but surface level person felt fine, no obvious symptoms to report, but I know we did some advanced diagnostic screening and imaging and kind of found some real issues, right?
Yeah, and so, you know, the layman would say, how in the world could you have a 90% blockage to one of the major arteries to your heart and not know it, right? Well, the answer to that is that doesn't happen overnight. If it happens overnight, you have an acute myocardial infarction. But what happens the majority of the time, this is a slow progressive process, much like we were talking about before with diabetes. You don't get 90% blockage overnight. It's probably a 10+ year process. And so if something narrows very, very slowly, your body develops some collateral flow and you kind of adapt and you don't notice it as much. You just think, oh, well, I'm overworking. I'm out of shape. I feel a little short of breath when I exert myself. I'm just tired all the time. But unfortunately, it can be that those are symptoms of just overworking and not sleeping well, but it can also be a symptom of atherosclerosis. So utilizing, you know, I think the imaging component and finding calcifications where you might not otherwise, finding inflammatory markers that are elevated, doing a risk analysis of their cardiovascular risk factors really is helpful in identifying early disease before it becomes a catastrophic condition. Now, you know, cardiologists will tell you just because you have some atherosclerosis and you have some blockages, so a high percentage of Americans after the age of 40 are going to have some degree of atherosclerosis. You may have a 20% narrowing or a 30% narrowing. That does not mean that needs to go and have a stent associated with it. Stenting typically would be 70% or higher. So I don't want people to think that we're going to find lesions and run people to have stents unnecessarily. But finding them when they're in this high risk for stenosis and acute event 70+, does make a huge difference. So I think we literally saved this person's life because they were on the verge of a probable acute myocardial infarction in an area that supplies the pacemaker to the heart, which is one of the most common reasons for sudden death.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's, as we kind of round out here, let's jump to the next slide, Cassie, if we could. So again, you know, our challenge or kind of the way we're framing this program is this isn't necessarily just a perk or an incentive. Like this is kind of a strategic response to shifting your leader continuity strategy from a reactive to more of a proactive posture. You know, obviously we want your leadership at full capacity between, you know, energy focused decision making. That was kind of more to the slide of like, how do we just optimize, you know, human performance to, on the flip side of that, the example Dr. Turnbow just walked through with our MARC patient, you know, avoiding the catastrophe and creating the Tuesdays that never happened from the previous slide. We want this to be strategic and intentional versus a scramble, you know, for your organization in the event that, you know, something this ever did unfortunately happen. So who is this for? Like, is this for multi-billion-dollar companies with thousands of people? That's kind of what we're going to dive into now. You guys have probably heard about these programs, you know, between Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, Vanderbilt has had, you know, flavors of these types of programs before. I think we gave some examples and kind of early teasers that this isn't tens and thousands of dollars to implement. This could maybe be $1,000 to start off with a version of this type of program. And we're gonna dive a little bit more into that. But this is really for organizations who want to intentionally think about their leadership strategy, their leadership health benefit program, and how to mitigate risk by protecting the most important people within your umbrella. All right. So won't spend a ton on this. I think Dr. Turnbow kind of already hit this. Again, the difference between traditional physicals and kind of the HealthWorks executive approach, hurried versus unhurried, reactive versus proactive. Dr. Turnbow, you kind of already walked through a lot of the difference between the standard and advanced kind of diagnostics and screening panels there. And again, I think it was interesting just the design to buy, like what is the traditional health physical designed and kind of inspired by versus what we're trying to shape here. Any other thoughts on that before we jump ahead?
And again, I'm not trying to throw shade on traditional physicals.
Sure.
I do traditional physicals on a regular basis in the world in which it's the fee-for-service world, and they're limited with resources that are dictated by the insurance company, and that is just an example of doing the best you can with what you got.
Absolutely.
But do I think that I'm giving the absolute best physical and screening tests that I can provide for patients? The answer to that's no, just being honest with you. I love what we do at HealthWorks because it gives me an opportunity to take the gloves off and to be able to think, what is the absolute best that I could do for a patient to be able to help them identify and or prevent disease? And that's what this is a result of. If I had resources and I had the time to dive in, this is what it would look like. And so it's not for everybody because not every organization is going to be able to spend those resources.
Sure.
Not every individual is going to be able to spend those resources. But again, the entire country's screening mechanism and annual physicals are dictated by that United States Preventive Task Force, and their goal is to be good stewards of healthcare dollars. So how much money do we spend, or will we have to spend to save one person's life, or to actually just increase a person's life year? And that's just reality because not everybody can have a Rolls Royce. But if you have people that do have the resources and they have key people that are going to make a huge impact on their business if they are incapacitated or impaired or lost, this is what we would recommend to do to be able to protect those folks.
Yeah, and just kind of going back to the opening statement, your organization is likely already doing that from a variety of other business functions, right? You're insuring your building from fire, you're insuring your vehicles for loss, we're cybersecurity and, IT policies. And, we're really just kind of challenging to reframe and rethink that same perspective for your people. Are we doing everything possible for, again, leadership continuity, loss of operational disruption, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, good stuff. Let's jump to, as we round out here, again, I think we're getting close to kind of finishing up the discussion. Definitely want those kind of questions, comments to come across the chat. So just one more friendly reminder, see some hands being raised. I don't think we can take a live audio question from Ms. Stinnett there, but if you want to drop a question in the chat, please feel free, question, comment. We'd love to hear that. You can either drop it in the chat or send it kind of direct to us as a host. We'd be glad to field those questions. But in the meantime, for those of you out there listening and you're curious, you want to talk about, this type of concept, how you could potentially, incorporate this into your organization. What does it cost? What does it look like? How would you deploy this? Next step for us would just be reach out to us, shoot us a message. We would do a free, confidential executive health consultation, with someone on your leadership team to just kind of better understand how you're structured, what your needs are, what type of resources are available for this type of program. And then we would come back to you with some recommendations. Typically, we like to recommend 2 to 3 different options that you can employ that scale to your appetite and your needs. And then typically what we like to do is kind of pilot this within, a few key leaders first within your organization, get their feedback, make sure it's going to be a good fit, and then potentially, scale it further from there if we think it's going to be a win long term. So For those listening, feel free to reach out to us. We have some contact information here at the end. You can scan a QR code here on this next slide. Let's go ahead and jump to that, Cassie, if you don't mind. Feel free to scan that or just shoot us an email, info@healthworksmedical.com. That'll come right to our relationship management team, and we can reach out and follow up with you with your specific questions. So I think we have a few minutes left here. Definitely want to hop into some questions. I do see a couple questions coming across the chat right now. Cassie, would you mind hitting us with some questions, what you're seeing?
Yeah. First one that popped in says, how do you protect privacy while the employer is paying for the program?
Yeah.
Good question. You want to take that one?
Yeah, it's no different than health insurance, right? The health insurance is the payer, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have access to all of the personal health information. So in this instance, just because someone is paying the bill does not mean they have a right to the person's personal health information. So it falls under HIPAA. It's still protected personal health information. The employer does not have any right to see it or a need to know to see it. So in occupational health, we're definitely used to protecting people's personal health information and giving the employer, for example, information about fit for duty, not fit for duty, fit for duty with restrictions or not restrictions. So this is an instance in which I don't see it's necessary for the organization to know any of the personal health information of the employee or the patient. That's something that's between the patient and the clinician to keep the clinician healthy. This is really an investment in the employee, the executive, to be sure that they do everything that they can to keep themselves healthy and at high performance.
Yeah, I have nothing to add there. I think it's really no different from a confidentiality perspective to what your normal, primary care interaction would be. So good. What else?
Let's see. Another question says, can this work alongside our existing primary care physician or specialist?
Absolutely. I mean, so this is not designed to take the place of a primary care physician. Being a primary care physician, I think it's important that you establish those relationships and have that ongoing availability and cooperation and teamwork to make sure that you're monitoring any treatment program that is put in place. So it's not designed to assume the role of the primary care physician. It's designed to actually augment what the primary care physician doesn't have the resources or the time to do. Then you can take that information back to your primary care doctor, let them help guide the intervention. Great.
All right. Let's see, there's another one that just popped in. So is this something that only large corporations can afford?
Yeah. Well, all I was going to say is to the contrary. Typically, large organizations have large C-suites, so they have the ability to absorb a loss within their C-suite better than smaller organizations do, where a loss of an executive could be hugely impactful and detrimental.
Yeah, I'll use an example too on the flip side of that. Some of the most exciting implementations of this program that I've been a part of are with just the small kind of mom and pop organizations. We actually did an implementation or a version of this type of program for a local law enforcement agency where government funding's tight, couldn't just, do every aspect of this program, but we worked with them and said, hey, we want to do enhanced cardiovascular screenings moving forward for this population. Like you said, for $175 a person, we can get some really good insight to expanded cardiovascular risk just with one program. So there's multiple ways to kind of implement and launch this. And I think that's what's so cool about, working with companies to understand their needs and their resources and designing something that makes sense for them.
Yeah, and I think 10 years ago or so when people thought about executive health physicals, they were talking tens of thousands of dollars to have some of this stuff. The cost is, a lot of this technology is so much less that it makes it much more affordable for a wider segment of the population. So I think we're proud of that. We're trying to minimize the cost of it to get the most bang for your buck, if you will. I think the biggest cost driver in all of this is the screening analysis for early detection of cancer, and we don't have a lot of control of the cost of that. So that does make it a little higher than it would otherwise have to be, but really a good value for what you get.
It's kind of like the analogy for the flat screen TVs when they first came out. Remember at one time, I think they were $10,000 plus for a plasma TV. Is that what they called them initially? And then you can go to Walmart now and get $200, something now. And I think we're seeing that the speed of that, to your point, is changing in healthcare as well, where some of these tools and technology that was not available to the general population, 10, 15 years ago, we're starting to see at our doorstep now, which is really, really exciting. But no, I mean, that's really all we had planned today. I would like to thank everyone for their time, for joining us. I think just circling back to how we started, we posed the question of how many people in your organization, if they were gone today, would be challenging to replace. And just looking at some of these answers, I see Irvin Smith said 4 to 5, Jared Harrell said 6+, yeah. Stinnett said 4 to 6. So just to kind of give you an idea of scale, and of course I have no idea how big those organizations are that you guys are referencing, but I can tell you that is not uncommon, that feedback to what we see kind of across the board. So any closing thoughts, Dr. Turnbow, before we get out of here today?
We're doing this and offering this not as a major line to our business, but as a calling. I think it's important that as an organization who is dedicated to supporting the health and welfare of our partner organizations, not doing this was something that was just really not on our radar. We almost feel like we have to offer something like this to complete the offering that we provide for holistic services for our corporate clients. And so for us, it's factual, evidence-based medicine, which will change. My recommendations for the best evidence-based screening may change in the next month, it may change in the next 6 months, but it will definitely change within the next year. And so my job is to keep up with evidence-based screening tools and the best possible options and mechanisms for changing or modifying the disease processes. And so this is not something we're going to be doing a lot of every day, and we're going to dedicate time so that when these folks come, it's an efficient process. They get one-on-one care in a very caring and thorough environment. So I hope folks will take advantage of it, but I'm just proud that we're offering it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining us yet again for another webinar. Again, this is something we're passionate about. We try to do this from time to time just to share kind of the hot topics in the corporate health and occupational health conversation that we have the privilege of supporting, again, with our clients across the country, helping them bend the needle on their healthcare needs and healthcare strategies. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Again, if you would like to learn more about the specifics of how your organization could benefit from a potential executive health program or strategy, feel free to reach out. We'll schedule some time. Myself or Dr. Turnbow will connect with you, and we'll see what makes sense for you. Thank you guys so much. Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Until next time.